Module 2 describing the situational characteristic of registers and genres. 2.1 Introduction. In the last module, we defined a register as a language variety associated with a particular situation of use and introduced the three major components of register analysis: the situational characteristic, the pervasive linguistic features, and the communicative function that explain why these linguistic features occur in the situational context. In the present module, we focused on the situational, that is, on how to describe characteristics related to the situation of use, or what we call situational characteristic. These characteristics include the physical context, such as the actual time and place, but also many other considerations. For example, the situational characteristic or face-to-face conversation include the fact that there are two or more participants producing language in the spoken mode interacting directly with one another in a shared place and time. The situational characteristics of news reports are very different, with a single author producing language in the written mode for a large number of readers scattered across different places and times. An analysis of situational characteristic is important for the general perspective as well as the register perspective, and most of the issues discussed in this module relate to both. In contrast, style variation is independent of the situational context, and thus we do not address the perspective in this module. This module begins with This module begins by discussing two issues related to the identification of registers and genres. First, how these text varieties can be described at different levels of generality, and second, cultural distinction among registers or genres. We then develop a framework for analyzing situational characteristics, providing a template that you can use for your own register or genre analysis. Module 3 builds on this framework, describing the next steps in the process: the analysis of linguistic features and the integration of the linguistic and situational analysis through the process of functional interpretation. 2.2 Issues in the identification of registers and genres. Before analyzing the situational characteristic of a next variety, you must of course identify the variety that you want to investigate. Two issues are especially important here: recognizing the level of generality of different register and genres, and appreciating the role of culture in identifying registers and genres. 2.2.1 General specialized registers and genres. In this module, we introduce the idea the register can be more or less specialized. For example, conversation is one of the most general spoken register with relatively few specifying characteristic, two or more participants interacting directly with one another in spoken mode. Telephone conversation is more specified because the participants must be communicating via an electronic channel and do not actually share the same physical place. Family dinner table conversation is even more specified with a particular setting, a particular set's participants, and particular topics that are typically discussed. Speeches or public speaking is another example of a very general spoken register with many more specialized sub-registers such as sermons, political speeches, academic lecture, etc. It is similarly possible to distinguish among general and specialized registers within writing. For example, academic prose is a very general register characterized as written language that has been carefully produced and edited, addressed to a large number of readers who are separated in time and space from the author, and with the primary communicative purpose of presenting information about some topic. But there are many more specialized written academic registers. The distinction between textbooks and academic research books involves the intended audience, students versus other professionals, and the more specific communicative purposes, introducing and surveying an academic field versus presenting the result of a new research project. Similar to academic research book, research articles is an academic journal are also written for other professionals but focused on the result of a specific study. There are also important registered differences among academic disciplines. For example, psychology research article is different from a chemistry research article, and both are different more history research articles. See Module 6. In fact, that the research article of some academic disciplines even more specific sub-registers can be identified. For example, science research articles typically have four sections: introduction, methods, results, discussion. The methods section is quite different from the introduction of discussion sections. The method section focuses specifically on a description of the pro- procedures and materials used in a study, while the introduction and discussion sections present more general survey of previous research and discuss the broader motivation and application of the study. As you will see in Module 6, specific communicative differences like this result is systematic register differences associated with different set of linguistic features. It is important to recognize that there is no single right level for a register analysis. Rather, situation characteristic and linguistic features can be analyzed for a general register or a very specific register. An investigation may have start with a general register and then shift to analyzing the more specific sub-register within it. There will be more variation among texts within a general register than a specific subregister, and so the linguistic analysis of general register will need to be based on a large sample of text. When analyzing the situation of a specific subregister, most characteristic can be a definite specified for very specific registers, while general registers will have more variability for certain categories. For example, for the general register of conversation, it is not possible to identify specific communicative purposes or specific characteristic of the participants. In contrast, it is possible to be more specific in the situation description of workplace conversation among colleagues or the dinner table conversations among family members. However, as Module 4 to 10 show, linguistic differences can be functionally associated with situational characteristics when register are specified at any level of generality. While register differences can be regarded as a continuum of variation, general differences are more discrete. Further, genres are not as easily analyzed along a hierarchy of generality. For example, it makes sense to describe the genre of this scientific research article identifying the linguistic conventions used to structure text. However, it is not useful to transcribe a more general genre of academic writing since there are not general convention used to structure the different kinds of text that could be included in the category. Similarly, a specific spoken variety like sermons delivered in Lutheran churches can be described from a general perspective, but it is unlikely that sermons of all types would share general conventions, and the general textual category of public speaking could certainly not be described from a general perspective. At the same time, there are cases where a genre is embedded in a larger genre. For example, introductory section in scientific research articles can be analyzed as a genre with its own conventional structure. See Module 6. From this perspective, the entire introductory section would be regarded as a complete text. This text presented the genre of introductions because they conform, conform to the expected conventional organization, first viewing previous research, then identifying a gap in pres- previous research, and finally starting how the present study fills that gap. At the same time, research articles introduction are embedded in the large genre of the specific research article, which has its own conventional structure, typical being organized as abstract introduction, methods, results, discussion. 2.2.2 Culturally recognized register genres distinctions. In many cases, general register genres have short, simple names, while more specialized text varieties have longer, more complex names. For example, conversation includes many different specialized kinds of interaction, but those are often referred to with longer names like telephone conversation, workplace conversation among colleagues, etc. However, speakers sometimes employ short, simple names for specialized text varieties. For example, a syllabus is a specialized variety used only in school context to describe the context of a course and set out the student expectation and requirements. A deed is a legal document that grant right to some property or privilege. The fact that these specialized text varieties have simple names indicated that they are widely recognized within speaker English speaking culture as distinct varieties that serve important function. Genres generally have simple names in a culture, but this is not always the case for registers. That is, genres are governed by specific conventions generally recognized by members of a culture, and so the genre itself is named within the culture. These same varieties can also be analyzed from a register perspective, and we would use the same. However, it is not the case that all registers have simple names. For example, workplace conversation among colleagues, describing a text variety that occur in a particular situation of use, and there are linguistic features functionally associated with the situation. Thus, this variety can be analyzed from a register perspective, even though it does not represent well-defined genre. Further, not all text varieties with a simple name can be regarded as genres. For example, sermons and lectures might be regarded as a specialized subregisters of speeches or the general register of public speaking, but we would need to consider specific types of sermons to be able to apply the general perspective. So, for example, it is unlikely that a sermon delivered by a Roman Catholic priest will have the same general conventions as a sermon delivered by a Southern Baptist preacher. Similarly, conversation describe a very general register, but many conversations are not clearly instructed by general conventions. In some cases, a very specialized domain has multiple genres registers that are familiar to expert in the field, but not generally familiar to the public. For example, the legal domain includes genres registers such as affidavit, deposition, and pleading. The legal government domain includes treaties, regulations, laws, and ordinances. In the religious domain, there are prayers, benediction, and eulogies. Here again, the use of a simple name indicates that these varieties are overtly recognized by members of the subculture as representing meaningful distinctions, even though they may not be known by others outside the subculture. It is normal for a culture to make general register distinctions that are not recognized in other cultures. For example, Durante 1994 described that the different kinds of speeches that occur during the course of a phono in Western Samoa English speakers would probably recognize the phono as a kind of village council to discuss political and judiciary matters. However, there are many speeches given in a phono, and it is unlikely that English speakers would perceive those to be different registers for a speaker of Samoa. However, the speeching given during a phono fall into several distinct general register categories, including lauga, the main ceremonial speech, tali, replies, Talanuaga discussions. In addition, there are distinct genres within a Lauga, including the Fola Saga Introduction and Faafetai Thanksgivings. A second example of the importance of culture in general register identification comes from Baso's 1990 114 FF description of oral storytelling among the Western Apache for different kinds of categories are distinguished. Godihio Nagolide creation, stories told by medicine men and women to enlighten and instruct about how the universe came to be way it is. Ogodzahi, historical moral story about event that took place a long time ago before the arrival of Europeans, intended to emphasize the importance of proper behavior and the bad consequences of improper behavior. In Teego Nagoldi, stories about events that occurred within the past several decades told to entertain listeners. Chidi gossip, stories about recent events about other members of the Western Apache community who are currently living in the community. In this case, members of English-speaking cultures in the USA and the UK would recognize all of these as stories. They would probably be able to describe the major differences in the stories, but those differences are not especially important in many English-speaking cultures except for gossip, which is widely recognized as a distinctive type of story. As a result, where members of Western Apache culture regard this as four different genres register. Most members of Anglo culture would recognize only one or two genres register, simply stories or stories versus gossip. Often, members of a culture distinguish two different registers primarily by their communicative purposes, while the physical circumstances might appear to be nearly identical to the casual outside observer. For example, the register of tafsir and wad in Arabic speaking Islamic cultures might both be perceived as sermons by a casual outside observer. Both are monologic registers performed by a sheikh as a part of religious ceremony in a mosque. But the two differ in their primary communicative purposes. The tafsir is more informational and explanatory, presenting content from the Quran and Hadith and explaining its meaning. In contrast, the wad is more persuasive and exhortatory, encouraging audience members to be devout and practice the precepts of the religion. Normally, these two registers occur in sequence. The sheikh would first quote of passage from the Quran and Hadith, then move on to tafsir, explaining the content of the passage, and finally present wad, discussion of the particular implication of the passage and an encouragement to act in a certain way based on those implications. These same kinds of language are common in what an English speaker would recognize as a sermon. However, in many Arabic speaking cultures, the The two are recognized as distinct registers. All three of the above examples illustrated how general register distinction are culture specific. Furthermore, even when two cultures have seemingly equivalent general registers, they can return out to be different because they have distinct communicative purposes. For example, both American English and Somali cultures have a general register used the personal written communication sent by surface mail from one individual to another, the personal letter American English, and the warqad in Somali. Until recently, such texts were relatively common in each of the two cultures. More recently, letters have come to be replaced by electronic communication in many cultures. Although these more generous registers are similar in many respects, they differ in their typical communicative purposes. Personal letters in American English are usually written for general interpersonal communication to maintain a relationship and inform the address about recent personal events in the author's life. In contrast, warqad in Somali are usually written because the written needs something from the addressee. These differences have important linguistic consequences. Warqad contain many directives statements that tell the addressee what they should do using grammar features like imperatives and optative clauses which express wishes. In contrast, personal letter in the American English contain many questions asking the addressee about their circumstances and first persons stance constructions telling about the personal circumstances of the writer. In summary, different cultures have different ways of diving up the range of activities that are performed using language. One culture might perceive relatively small differences in purpose to be manifestation or different registers and or genres, while another culture could perceive the same range communicative events to all represent a single genre or register. Further, the same genre register in two cultures can actually be characterized by important differences in purpose or other situational characteristics. Therefore, the first step in conducting an analysis is to identify and describe the situation characteristic of the general register. A framework 2.3, a framework for situational analysis. Effective register analysis are always comparative. It is virtually impossible to know what is distinct about a particular register without comparing it to other registers. So, for example, Cooper and Hago, 1984, described the register characteristic of livestock auctions by comparison to the more general register of oral poetry and conversation. There are a few register studies can focus exclusively on a single register, such Ferguson's 1983 description of sports announcers stock of route tracks, 1996 description of classified advertisements. In these cases, the researcher relies on the institutions and previous experience with other registers to identify the distinctive characteristic of the target register. This is may not recommended practices because institutions of normal behavior are often not reliable. Thus, in the present course, the analysis of register characteristics, situational and linguistic, will generally focus on the comparison of two or more registers. Particular situational characteristic will be more or less important depending on the registers that are being compared. For example, face-to-face conversation, email messages, and text messaging are all similar in many respects. All three registers are produced by a person addressing another person, often dealing with personal social topics, and they are typically interactive where the second person responds to the first. One of the main differences between the registers in the physical mode, speech versus electronically conveyed writing. The three also differ with respect to the immediacy of the response. In contrast, a comparison of conversation and sermons would need to focus on different characteristics. Both registers share the spoken mode, but they differ in their interactivity. Conversation is highly interactive with two or more participants contributing to the discourse, while sermons are produced by one person and therefore not interactive. Of course, communicative purpose and topic are also major factor in distinguishing among these two registers. Conversations can be about any topic, and participants often shift among several communicative purposes, revealing personal feeling and attitudes, describing past events, and sometimes trying to persuade listeners. Sermons are much more constrained for both topic and purpose. The topic is generally related to the religion, is scripture and lifestyle, while the purpose is general, informative, and or persuasive. In the following section, we introduce the method for conducting a situational analysis, suggesting several sources of information that can be used from this purpose. Then in section 2.3.2, we introduce a comprehensive analytic framework and identifying the set of situational characteristics that are potentially useful for register analysis. As noted above, this framework can be applied to analyze the situational characteristic of any text variety, whether the ultimate goal is to apply the general perspective or the register perspective. Methods for this 2.3.1 method for describing the situational characteristic of a register. There are a numbers of sources of information that can help you describe the situational characteristic of register. The importance of each of the sources below will differ depending on how involved you are with the cultural group the categorizes the register, and how much experience you have with the register yourself. Further, some characteristic will be easily to analyze based on your own experience, while other will require more research. For example, it is no problem to tell from your own observation whether a register is spoken or written even if you have no previous experience with it. But determining the communicative purposes of a register may require more primarily research. 2.3.1.1 Your experience and observation. If you are part of the culture group that use a register and have personal experience producing the register effectively, your own knowledge can be one major source of information that you use for the situational analysis. However, even in this case, it will require some thinking and discussion with other member of the cultural group to be confident about your interpretation. For example, since you have had many experiences engaging in conversation with friends, you could list the situational characteristic of that register without consulting any other sources. Having also read many textbooks, you could probably describe the situational characteristic of that register, including some of the variability in purpose, such as entertaining versus purely informative. Particular textbooks are. However, observers are novices in a professional domain generally cannot fully describe the register identified by practitioners in that domain. For example, academic professionals make many fine distinction among the various kinds of published articles, including research articles, review articles, book viewers, and commentaries. Academic professionals also distinguish among the various venues for a published article, including referred research journal, non-referred journals, newsletters, and as a chapter in an edited book to casual observers and novices. All these registers are simply published articles, thus many analysis required additional information beyond what you can obtain from your own experience and observation. 2.3.1.2 Expert informants. When you do not have a great deal of experience with a register, asking expert informants about it can help you identify its situational characteristic. To continue the academic example above, if you were describing academic research articles, interviewing your professors about the characteristic of particular subregisters would be invaluable. Of course, individuals vary in their perception, is it is always helpful to speaker with several informants. The expert informants, it is more important if you are describing registers used in a culture that is not your own native culture, because it is unlike that an outside observer will fully understand the cultural significance of communication events. It is natural to interpret such events relative to the registered distinction that you recognize from your own native culture. In this case, the expert native informants is essential to helpful you recognize the registered distinction found in the target culture. 2.3.1.3 Previous research. Previous research is also a good potential source of information about situational characteristic. For example, studies from a rhetorical perspective can help you understand how a register is used within its cultural context. To continue our example from above, if you were studying scientific research articles previously published, case studies of professional writers in science could help you understand the purposes and audiences of the register, such as the early study done by Bizerman 1988 and Latour and Woolgar 1986. 2.3.1.4 Analysis of text from the register. Many descriptions of register based on your experience or others' expertise or something even published work represent belief of perceptions rather than the results of an empirical investigation. Such descriptions are not necessarily accurate because it is often the case that there will be some situational characteristics that are not consciously recognized by users of a register. For this reason, it is always useful to obtain additional information about the situational characteristic by looking at the text themselves. Text can aid in determining situational characteristic in one of two ways. First, it can be useful to look at text during your initial situational analysis in order to identify their typical communicative purposes. Example, this way necessary for us and authors of these modules when we carried out the case studies of electronic interpersonal register in Module 7. Neither of us regularly used some of these register or really understood why other people use them, so we can apply a three-prong approach for our description. We look in previous studies of electronic interpersonal registers. We interviewed participants to ask why they use the registers, and we look at a large collecting of actual text to analyze the types of purposes that were apparent in the text themselves. It is also used to analyze the situational characteristic of particular text a second time after the linguistic features and analyze. That is, when you have completed your linguistic analysis, you might discover an anticipated linguistic patterns and realize that those patterns must correspond to situational characteristics that you were unaware of previously. For example, as we will explain in Module 3, in a study of classroom teaching, a group of researchers were unable to predict some situational characteristics that became obvious after the linguistic features has been studied. Even though the researchers had all been producing classroom discourse for years, a fuller, explicit understanding of the situational characteristic came only when the linguistic features were connected of their functions. Thus, the process of doing a register analysis after often includes refining the analysis of the situational characteristics after the linguistic analysis. Despite the sometimes cyclic nature of the linguistic and situational analysis, the normal way to start a register analysis is by identifying and describing the situational characteristic that define the registers. The text section presents an analytical framework for this task. 2.3.2. The framework for analyzing situational characteristics. Since text varieties can be compared with respect to so many different situational characteristics, it is useful to have a general framework to apply in any analysis for either the register or general perspective. Some characteristics will not be relevant for some comparisons, but applying the framework can help you think through the full set of situational characteristics that need to be considered. Table 2.1 lists the major situational characteristics that are relevant for describing and comparing registers and genres. These characteristics were applied in Table 2.1 situational characteristic of registers and genres. 1. Participants. A. Addressors, speakers, or authors. 1. Single plural institutional unidentified. 2. Social characteristic, age, education, professional. B. Addresses. 1. Single plural unenumerated. 2. Self or others. C. Are there onlookers? 2. Relations among participants. A. Interactiveness. B. Social role, relative status or power. C. Personal relationship, friends, colleagues, strangers. D. Shared knowledge, personal specialist. Channel. A. Model, speech, writing, or singing. Signing. B. Specific medium. Permanent, tape, transcribed, printed, handwritten, email, transient, face-to-face, telephone, radio, TV. Processing circumstances. A. Production. Real-time, planned, script, revised, and edited. B. Comprehension. Real-time skimming, careful reading. Setting. A. Are the time and place of communication shared by participants? B. Place of communication. 1. Private or public. 2. Specific setting. C. Time, temporary or historical time period. Communicative purposes. A. General purposes. Narrate, report, describe, inform, explain, interpret, persuade, how to, procedural, entertain, edify, reveal, self. B. Specific purposes. Summarize information from numerous sources, describe methods, present new research findings, take moral through personal story. C. Purported factuality. Factual opinion is speculative, imaginative. D. Expression of stance. Epistemic, attitudinal, no overt stance. Topic. General topic domain. Domestic, daily activities, business, workplace, science, education, academic, government, legal, politics, religion, sports, art, entertainment. B. A specific topic. C. Social status of person being referred to. From a survey of a previous theoretical frameworks that have been developed for the study of register. Crystal and Davy, 1969, Himes, 1974, Basso, 1974, Halliday, 1978, Biber, 1988, Biber et al., 1994. In the following section, we describe each of those characteristics in terms. 2.3.2.1 Participants. We begin with the participants, that personal producing the text and the person to whom the text is addressed. Every text is produced by someone. The addressors Most spoken registers are produced by individuals who are readily identifiable. However, the addressors can be less apparent in written registers. Example of present course has been produced by two co-authors, and in fact, any sentence in these modules might have been written, revised, edited by either or both of us. Other written texts are not attributed to a specific author. Some of these texts have an institutional addressors. They can be attributed to some institution, but there is no indication of who actually wrote the text. Example, new editorials can represent the official point of view of news organization with a specific author being identified. Similarly, a university catalog present an official description of services and requirements with no indication of who produced the text. At the far extreme, there are anonymous written texts that are not even attributed to an institution, such as certain kinds of sign of advertisements. The social characteristic of the addressors have a major influence on the language produced in text. For example, characteristics like the speaker's age, sex, level of education, occupation, and social class can all the important determinants of linguistic variation. Such characteristics are described under the rubric of social dialect variation, although we will have little to say about social dialect variation in the present course. This characteristic of the speaker should be considered as part of the larger situational context for a register. In addition to the addressor, communication requires an addressee, the intended listener, or reader. In many cases, the addressee can be an individual, as in a face-to-face conversational with a friend. Personal letters, email messages, and text messages are also typically addressed to an individual. However, most of these texts can also be addressed to multiple individuals. For example, a dinner table conversation can involve a two group of individuals all discussing the same topic. Everyone except the speaker can be the addressee of an utterance. University classroom teaching in address to a larger group of listeners, while a major conference lecture might be addressed to a group of several thousand listeners. In these cases, although the group of addresses may be very large, it is possible to identify who they are. There are some registers, however, that have an unenumerated set addresses. For example, it is not possible to a specific except in a very general sense. The set of individuals who listen to a radio broadcast or television show. Published written registers provides even clearer example of registers with an unenumerated set of addresses. For example, a novel can exist physical for decades or even centuries, and there is no obvious way to identify who the set of readers will be over that time. Finally, the situational context for some registers includes a group of onlookers. These are participants who observe but are not the direct addresses of the register. For example, actors in a dramatic play of conversing addressing one another on the stage, but the entire conversational interaction of observed by the audience of onlookers. Similarly, participants in a debate or during courtroom testimony directly address one another, but they are also aware of the audience of onlookers. In fact, the role of the onlookers might have more practical importance than the addressee. For example, during court testimony, a witness is directly addressing an examining attorney, but the major purposes of communication is to persuade a group of onlookers, the jury. In cases like this, the distinction between addressee and onlooker is somewhat fuzzy. The most important point for register analysis is that you recognize the influence of both. 2.3.2.2 Relations among participants. Once you have identified the participants, the next step is to describe how they relate to one another. The most important consideration here is interactiveness. To what extent do the participants directly interact with one another? At one extreme, there are registers like conversation, where all participants are present and able to directly respond to one another. At the opposite extreme are registers like university catalogs, because it is very difficult to even identify the exact authors of this text. It is virtually impossible to have an interactive dialogue with the authors. Most registers are intermediate in their degree of interactiveness. For example, participants in an email interchange directly respond to one another, but that interaction can be spread over days and weeks. A university class session will normally be interactive, but not equally for all participants. Rather, the instructor will typically produce most of the language and control the extent to which students can participate. A news report is even less interactive because the author is not easily accessible to address a response to. However, readers can post comments on online sites, allowing for a limited kind of interaction. Authors sometimes respond to such comments, resulting in a direct interaction between the original addressor and a particular addressee. However, it is more common for multiple addresses to post comments which often directly address issues raised in a post by a previous addressee. Thus, in this way, the commenting becomes an embedded interactive subregister, with readers interacting with one another rather than with the original author. In addition to the extent of interactiveness, it is important to consider the social roles and personal relationships among participants. In many cases, participants can be socially equal, as in the case of two classmates having a conversation, but in other cases, there can be important social differences among participants. For example, power differences can influence language choices, even in a casual conversation. If you are talking to your teacher or boss, you probably produce different language than when you talk to your best friend. Participants can also have different degrees of shared background knowledge. For example, imagine how you would describe your activities this past weekend when talking to your roommate, who knows most of your friends and the places where you like to go, in comparison to how you would describe those activities to a stranger. Speakers can also share especially specialist background knowledge. Imagine discussing a linguistic analysis with one of your classmates, contrasted with how you would describe the same analysis to your parents. Written text can also differ depending on a specialist share knowledge. For example, an academic research journal has articles addressed to other specialists in the field, while introductory textbooks are addressed to novices in the field. 2.3.2.3 Channel. One of the most obvious differences among registers is the physical channel or mode, speech versus writing. It turns out that the difference between speech and writing is intertwined with other situational characteristics. For example, registers produced in the spoken mode almost always have a specific addressor and typically have specific addresses. In contrast, written register can have an institutional addressors and enumerated addresses. Spoken registers are often interactive. Written registers are rarely interactive. Spoken and written registers also differ in their typical production circumstances and even their typical communicative purposes. See below. For all these reasons, the distinction between spoken and written registers is one of the most important situational parameters for the linguistic description of registers as we show as the following modules. Of course, not all registers are spoken or written. There are other specialized modes of communication. Signing in particular is fully developed mode of communication, while there are also much more restricted modes like drum talk or smoke signals. However, in the present course, we restrict ourselves to the description of spoken and written registers. It is also possible to distinguish among specific mediums of communication within speech or writing, such as telephone or radio for speech, and handwriting, electronic text messages, and printed for writing. This more specific means of expressing language can also have an influence on use the linguistic forms that the speakers employ. See the discussion of electronic interpersonal register in Module 7. 2.3.2.4 Processing Circumstances. The processing circumstances involve both the addressor and the addressee because they relate to both the production and the comprehension of the text. As noted above, the choice of the spoken or written mode directly influences the production circumstances. Consider a normal conversation. The speaker is producing language at the same time that he is thinking about what he wants to say. The speaker usually does not have time to carefully plan what he will say next. If he takes too long thinking, his conversational partner might begin to talk, or the conversation might end in miscommunication. And if he says something unintended, he must completely start over again. A speaker cannot simply edit or erase language once it has been spoken. Written registers typically differ in all of the respect. The writer has as much time as needed to plan exactly what she wants to write, and if she writes something unintended, she can revise, edit, delete, and add language until she ends up the language that conveys exactly the intended meaning. Thus, the final written text that the reader sees may bear little resemblance to the initial words that the author wrote, and readers usually have no indication of the extent to which the author has revised the original text. Some types of spoken language can be edited to some extent, as in the case of a tape or radio interview, but in this case, the editing is restricted to removing unwanted language. It is not possible to change what has been said. The addressee similarly has different circumstances for comprehension. In the spoken versus written mode, in speech, a listener have no choice but to hear and understand language at the same time that the speaker produces it. There is no opportunity to control the speed or sequence of information apart from telling the speaker to slow down. In contrast, a reader has complete control over the text. The reader can carefully read one word at a time, or she can quickly skim a text. She can even jump around in a written text, for example, reading the conclusion before the introduction. Of course, particular readers of a written text will engage in very different comprehension processes depending on their prior background knowledge of and purposes for reading. 2.3.2.5 Setting. The setting refers to the physical context and of the communication, the time and space and place. An important consideration here is whether the time and place are shared. In many spoken registers, the participants share the physical context, and so they can directly refer to it with words like yesterday or here. Such situational dependent reference is not appropriate in most written registers where the participants do not share the same time or place. However, some written texts do assume that the reader has knowledge of the time and sometimes place of production. If, for example, news report may mention a day of the week, Monday or even yesterday, showing that the text is meant to be read the day it was produced. Personal email messages and text messages generally assume even greater knowledge of the time and place of production. In addition, there are general characteristics of the setting that can be important. For example, is the place of communication private, conversation, texting, or public classroom teaching textbook? Both private and public communication can occur in almost any particular setting. For example, it is possible to have a private conversation with a friend as well as a public conversation with a customer in the exact same physical location at work. Written text may have a specific setting by being published as part of a larger document and such as a module within a course. Furthermore, the time of the communication can be relatively contemporarily or a historical time period. 2.3.2.6 Communicative Purpose. All of the situational characteristics considered above are tangible aspects of the context, which is participating where they are, what physical mode of communication is being used, and what the production circumstances are. However, it is equally important to consider the why of communication, the communicative purpose. Communicative purpose can be described on several different levels. It is usually possible to identify the general purposes of a register, such as narrating or reporting past events, describing some state of affairs, explaining and interpreting information, arguing or persuading, providing procedural information about how to perform certain activities, entertaining the addressee, and revealing personal feelings or attitudes. However, text and sub-registers also often have distinct specific purposes. In some cases, the subparts of a single text can represent distinct sub-registers, each with their own particular communicative purposes. For example, as noted in section 2.2.1, a typical scientific research article will be composed of four distinct sections that are explicitly labeled: Introduction, Methods, Results, Discussions, or IMRD. This section can be regarded as sub-registers differing mostly in their specific communicative purposes. Introductions describes the current state of knowledge in the field and might include some narration of past events or some explanation of concept or previous research findings. Then the method section will switch to a procedural communicative purposes describing how the study was conducted. Results section are usually descriptive, stating what was found in the study, while the discussion section is usually more interpretive, explanatory, and persuasive. All of these article sections have the same physical context, the same author, same readers, same production circumstances, etc. But there are important linguistic differences across article section associated with the shift in specific communicating purposes. Some texts combine several communicative purposes and thus they can be regarded as hybrids. For example, textbooks usually combine descriptive and explanatory purposes. Textbook is engineering discipline will also include procedural information, while textbook in the humanities will often include persuasive discussion and some narratives. Further, it is possible to switch purpose in the middle of a communicative event. For example, you might be having a conversation with a friend where you are discussing political candidates, describing specific policies that a candidate endorses. and trying to persuade your friend that a particular candidate is the most qualified. In this case, you would be describing the current state of affairs but also revealing your own attitudes and also trying to persuade to listener about the correctness of your point of view. But then it would be very easy to switch purposes. For example, telling a story about the last time that you went to vote and how long you had to wait in line and how someone else in line was behaving. This switch in purpose can be regarded as a shift in sub-register from one kind of conversation to another. Similarly, the changes in purpose across the IMRD sections of research article can be interpreted as shift to distinct sub-registers within the general register of search articles. However, it is more common to find texts that blend multiple communicative purposes. For example, consider for the following excerpt from a travel blog. The general purpose of this register is to provide information about a bike tour. However, the general goal is accomplished by integrating personal travel narratives with informational description of the biking route. Example 2.1, a hybrid text from a travel blog integrating narrative and informational communicative purposes. Let me guess, said the station master at Lancaster as he showed he were to stow my bike on the connecting train to Morecambe. You wouldn't be cycling to Bridlington by any chance. When I replied in the affirmative, his small audience on the platform were most impressed at his accuracy. I mean, not my pedaling power. It's quite simple, really, he explained. Anyone taking a bike to Morecambe must be going to Bridlington. This train never saw any cyclist for donkeys years. Now we now we got dozens of them and they are all doing the same thing. Beyond a shared desire to turn back the holiday clock by about 70 years, not much would appear to link Morecambe and Bridlington, but now a coast-to-coast cycle route does, and the Way of the Roses is evidently combining quite popular. Even in March, I met other riding it, and in under 2 years, caves and hotels all along its 170 miles length have begun to sprout cyclist welcome signs. The name is a slight misnomer since all but the first 20 miles are in the White Rose country and the route only touches the outskirts of Lancaster. A short detour to the city center would be perfectly possible, but extra mileage is never an appealing prospect for the cyclist looking to fit in 78 miles on the first day. In order to complete the route in 2 days, I had booked overnight accommodation at Ripon. I was aware most of the hills would come on the first day and all too painful aware by the end of it, but I felt I had to aim for something close to hallways to avoid a 100-mile ride on the second. You don't want to be going that far with bags on your bike. The road is superbly signposted throughout, so much so that you can almost leave the map in your pocket. After following the Loon upstream for a few miles, the flat top of Ingleborough pops into view to give you a chunk of Yorkshire to aim for. Just below Ingleton, the distinctive two-note call of the curlew accompanied me across the country border. The sort of perfect moment that lingers long in the mind after the ride is over to remind you why you did this sort of thing. In this case, the differing communicative purposes are not overtly marked as distinct sections in the text, although they do roughly correspond to paragraph The first and four paragraphs have the purpose of personal narration, while the second, third, and fifth paragraph have descriptive informational purposes. In other texts, such blending of communicative purposes can occur within paragraphs or even within a single sentence. Thus, while it is useful to identify the primary communicative purpose of a register, it is equally important to recognize that many texts are hybrids, blending multiple communicative purposes. Another parameter relating to purpose is purported factuality. Thus, the addressor intended to convey factual information, personal opinion, speculation, or fiction fantasy. This parameter can be useful for distinguishing among the primary intents of registers such as novel fiction versus a biography factual or a personal blog opinion versus a news report factual, but these are not discrete differences since speaker often mix fact and fantasy, and it is might be argued that no personal account can be truly factual. In addition, there are numerous notorious examples of texts that purport to be factual but turn out to be actually fictional. In some cases, such a speech event would be called a lie. More recently, though, such texts have sometimes been labeled fake news. A final parameter concerns the expression of stance. This parameter includes expression both of personal attitudes and of epistemic stance. The extent to which information is certain or generalizable or indicates the source of the information. For example, within the general register of news reporting, there are different types of text associated with different expression of instance. A typical report of a news event has little or no overt expression of instance. It, it simply states what happens. It may still convey a certain ideology, but overt markers of instance are generally limited to statements of the source, such as according to analysts. Reporting of scientific discoveries, on the other hand, are more concerned with expressing epistemic stance, especially the extent to which information is certain or generalizable. You would not be surprised to see expressions such as it is possible that or the findings suggest or in general, all of which are linguistic markers of epistemic stance. Science reporting reflects the concern in the scientific community about the extent to which claims are verifiable or can be generalized. At the opposite extreme, the primary focus of restaurant and entertainment reviews is on personal attitudes. In fact, the point of communication is to convey personal evaluations, which overt, sometimes such as the flavor was wonderful or unfortunately the one thing lacking was. 2.3.2.7 Topic. Finally, topic is an open-ended, a category that can be described at many different levels. It is possible to distinguish among very general topical domains, topical domains such as science, religion, politics, and sports, but any text have its own specific topics. Topic is the most important situational factor influencing vocabulary choice. The word used in the text are to large extent determined by the topic of the text. This is true both at the level of general topical domains, science writing versus business news, and very specific topical domains, research writing on biogenetic. In languages like Japanese, there is a specific aspect of topic that directly influences linguistic choice, the social status of any person that is being talked about. In this case, a specific honorific particles must be used that indicate social status. In general, topical differences are less influential for determining grammatical differences. Rather, the persuasive grammatical characteristics of a register are mostly determined by the physical situational context and the communicative purposes. There are some grammatical differences that might at first seem to be related to topic. For example, passive verbs are much more common in science and engineering textbooks than the humanities textbooks. However, these differences are influenced mostly by the differing communicative purposes of these disciplines rather than simply by differences in topic. These differences are discussed further in Module 6. 2.4 Applying the situational analysis framework in a register study. In Module 1, we presented the three major components of a register analysis. One, describing the situational characteristic of the register. Two, analyzing the typical linguistic characteristic of the register, and identifying the functional forces to help to explain why those linguistic features tend to be associated with those situational characteristics. Starting a register analysis with a through description of the situational characteristic can help you in several ways. For example, if you are studying a register used by cultural group that you are not very familiar with, the situational analysis will ensure that you are not inadvertently mixing register that the cultural group distinguishes. Similarly, if you are studying a very general register, it can ensure that you do not overlook sub-registers within it. Even with registers that you will know well, working through the characteristic in table 2.1 will ensure that you do not disregard important situational characteristic that might be crucial in interpreting the linguistic patterns. Usually reports or academic papers that describe a register analysis, including the case studies in later modules of this course, do not discuss all of the situational characteristic of every register studies. They might only present the major characteristic that distinguish among registers, or they might focus on those characteristics that prove to be important in interpreting the linguistic features. Nevertheless, it is important to consider all situational characteristics during the initial analytic process and not jump to conclusions about which are the most influential. Module 2 activities. Reflection and review. 1. Consider the following speech situations. They are always spoken and directly interactive with minimal time for speakers to plan what they say, but this situation differ with respect to other characteristics, identifying the most important differences in the communicative purposes, social relationship between participants, and other aspect of the situational context. A. Talking with your instruction after class, asking for an explanation of this difficult concept. Be talking with your advisors during office hour, planning your courses for next semester. C. Talking with a fellow student, deciding when to go get together to study as you leave class to go to different appointments. C. Talking with your best friend about what you did last weekend. E. Talking with five friends at a restaurant about what to order. F. Talking on the telephone with your mother about her recent vacation. Number 2. Think about another culture or subculture that you know well besides your home culture, or if you close, look at an ethnographic study that describes another culture. Describe 1 to 3 registers or genres that are different from register or genres in your home culture. What are the situational characteristics that distinguish this register or genres from others? Alternative, identifying example of the same register genres in two languages and then identify any situational differences between the two. Analysis practice. Number three, cookbooks and restaurants reviews in magazines deal with similar general topics but are quite different of many of their other situational characteristics. Complete the table of situational characteristic table 2.1 as completely as you can for the register, noting the similarities of differences between the two registers. Use any sources of information that you need in order to complete the table. Compare your answer with another student's and resolve any disagreements. Number four, news is a very general register. Identify the range of more specialized registers found on your favorite news website and describe the situational characteristic that distinguish among them. Then compare your list to the type of articles found on three other news websites. To what extent do news organizations employ the same subregisters? What news subregisters are found only on some website? 5. Make a list of all the email messages or text messages that you receive over the next week. Describe the important situational characteristic of each one, including the demographic characteristic of the sender, the social relationship between you and the sender, whether you are the sole recipient of the message or not, the primary communicative purposes of the message, and whether you consider the message to be carefully revised and edited or not. Then at the end of the week, try to develop a taxonomy of sub-registers based on the types of messages that you receive. Project ideas. 6. Do an internet search for a keyword that relates to your favorite social activities such as running, tennis, or movies. Pick 30 different sites that are identified by search representing at least 5 different register. You might need to scroll down past the initial sites returned by your search to find documents belonging to different register. Compare and contrast the important situational characteristic of the documents on each site, including the following: the author, the sender, if different from the author, the intended reader, including whether general or specialist, the communicative purposes, and any of the distinguishing characteristic. Based on your description, develop a primarily taxonomy of the kinds of register found on the searchable web. 6a. Carefully read each document that you analyze. For activity 6, to determine if the text has a single communicative purposes or if it is better treated as a hybrid. If the text has multiple communicative purposes, can you identify specific parts of the text that are dedicated to each purposes? Or are the purposes integrated throughout the text? 6b. It is usually easy to name the register of printed, published, written documents because of the physical appearance of the text. For example, newspaper editorials are printed in newspaper magazines, articles are printed in magazines. In contrast, it can be difficult to name the register of documents returned by a web search because there are few overt external signal and because there are registers found on the web that we do not normally encounter in printed media. Explore this characteristic of web documents by attempting to name the specific register for each of the 30 documents in your study. Then task 3 other raters to go through the same process and compare contrast the result. Discuss the implication of your analysis for other studies of register variation of the web. 6c. Read Biber and Egbert 2018, especially Module 1 and 3, Biber, Egbert, and Davis 2015, which discusses the interminate nature of many web documents and proposes a methodology for classifying documents into register category. Compare and contrast your own methods and findings with that study. 7. Choose a professional field that is of interest to you. It could be a field that you have worked in or are planning to enter, or the student of yours will be in, or that your spouse is in, etc. Using any sources of information that you need, your own experience, interviews with expert informants, previous research, sample text, compile a complete list of all the registers that professionals in the field need to be competent with receiving or producing. Briefly describe the distinguishing characteristic of each register.